Hey there, Internet. Welcome to the Hard On Gear channel, where I discuss and review my used and abused knives and gear. Hello, viewers of the Hog channel. We are jumping into what is quickly becoming one of my favorite video formats, the knife versus format. So this is going to be the second one of these, and if you haven't seen the first one, the Azula 2 versus the Guardian 3, you can check that video out. And in the beginning, I give a little bit more thorough of a description as to how I came up with the scoring system, and I go into a little more detail in some of the different areas as to why I worded things the way I did. So there's going to be some changes to this over time, but for now I'm just going to zip through these fairly quickly. Anything you see in red is scoreable. The score is going to be tallied with a dot tally, which is just a little forestry tool, which is just going to be dots and lines, which will end up being a total score out of 40 for each of these. And then there's also the option for a tie if I can't decide. So this will mostly be my opinion. I'm going to try my best to keep these videos fair and give an honest and unbiased kind of opinion as to which of these is better. The way I'm going to do that is by scoring them in individual categories. I've given a little extra weight to, say, value here. There's a couple that chances are if a knife wins one of these, they're going to win 3 or 4 of the categories. So I've given a little bit of extra weight to value, so it's not just 1 point. And I've broken up the material and specs into a lot more points. So because really I know that these are going to be ones that every individual is going to have a different opinion on. And this is really what the majority of people's opinions are going to be based off of, whether or not they buy one of these knives. There's going to be the materials and the specs and their main function, their purpose behind why they're buying it. So this is the way that I'm doing my versus videos for now, at least. And let me know what you think of them. Give this video a like if you enjoy this type of content and you want to see more of it. And let me know in the comments what you think I could do differently to make these versus videos better for you. Hit me up on Instagram and check that out. Let me know via email or the Instagram if you want a couple of these Hog stickers, and I might be able to hook you up. So I will keep my scorecard over here on the right. It is a 2-pager. You can see we've got different sections, materials and specs, then function, maintenance, aesthetics and appeal, aesthetic appeal, and then the value. So starting off at the beginning, one at a time, we are looking at first knife specs, blade properties, the usable blade length. So out of the two of these, the usable blade length category is going to have to go, to the 940-2, because as you can see, it just has more usable blade length. That's a very easy objective category. Don't have to think too hard on that one. So I'll just put a 9 or an M, and we'll give 1 point to the 940-2. Steel type, S30V, that's a tie because there really is no distinguishing factors. The heat treat, I'm not sure if it's a little bit different or not, but I think it's going to be very much up to opinion whether or not you like the S30V of Benchmade more than Spyderco. If there are any metallurgy experts in the comments who want to inform me why that statement was wrong, I'm always game to learn. Let me know down below. Yeah, steel type is a tie, so blade grind and edge geometry. So this is a tricky one because look at the amazing, super cool grind of this 940-2. That is about as unique of a knife grind as I've seen on any regular mid-range production knife. Now, the Manix 2's got this classic leaf-shaped blade, and it's very, 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 very utilitarian shape and design that I feel probably trumps most knife blades as far as if you're doing general EDC tasks, slicing paper, cutting into boxes, anything like that. It's very, very precise. The way the jimping and the finger choil position kind of works with the blade adds to it. But as far as the cutting edge and the blade geometry in general, I really, really, really enjoy the Manix 2 cutting performance-wise. If we're talking about the looks, the 940-2's blade is really cool. I very much like this grind and just the way it looks as you see the different patterns in the light. Well, this is the Hard On Gear channel, not the Everything's Pretty channel, so we're going to talk about the actual function. And for me, the blade grind and edge geometry of this are far superior as a cutting tool goes. And just through my own little tests, and I'll punch a few clips in here of me testing out these knives while I'm talking. And overall, they both cut just fine, but the Manix 2 is probably the better slicer of the two of them. So blade grind, edge geometry category going to the Manix 2. So hey, that's a nice even start so far. We got 1 point in each. Manix 2 940-2, and then 1 for the tie. Blade stock versus edge thickness. Wow, and this is an interesting way to word that. I don't know if that's the best way, but basically, which blade is executed the best given the fact that it's still thick enough to perform its job. So if you can get a really thick blade that's still really slicey, it's going to win that category. It's kind of interesting looking at these two knives because you've got a very thick blade stock, but this very interesting grind, which gets thin and then thick again towards the tip. So you've got a very thick, robust blade stock that gets fairly slicey at the edge. Really, if I wanted to get into specifics, I could measure everything, but I'm much more of a go by feel and experience kind of person than I am like a numbers guy, because to me it's all that the numbers mean something, but how hard you push with a knife, the angle of which you cut, how sharp you keep it, it becomes so muddy as far as like if you're trying to keep things completely perfectly square and even. I could have sharpened these both up the same and done a whole bunch of very specific testing. So I tried in the first video to really keep it fair and objective, but it really is almost impossible. So this is much more of an opinion piece than I'd like it to be, but that's what these versus videos are. So in my opinion, I think that the thick blade stock of the Manix 2, and as tough as this blade is pretty damn cool to have it as slicey as it is, because this thing is, when it's, especially when it's really sharp, a very, very, very slicey folding knife. Not quite as slicey as the paramilitary 2, because it gets a little thinner behind the edge, and it's definitely a little bit slicier of a knife, but still, for the extra bit of thick, sturdy blade that you get with this, and to still have it that slicey, this thing's thick, and it is still slicey, but it's not anything close to, in my experience, as slicey of a blade as the Manix 2. So we'll give blade stock to edge thickness ratio. I really like the execution of that leaf style Manix 2 blade. Gonna give it to the Manix 2. For the blade durability and toughness, you know, again, I gotta go with the Manix 2 only because it's a stouter blade. The design, the tip might be, you know, I say that. I don't know that one of the tips is going to be more likely to break off than the other on these. I just know that this feels more flimsy, and maybe it's just the pivot and less the blade, but the way that gets thin towards the middle, that seems like the likely spot where this would break. If this is going to break anywheres, I feel like it's going to be at the tip or where the big spider hole is, because realistically that round hole is compromising the strength of the blade, but not in a way that I feel is going to be a major issue for me. As far as the blade itself goes, not the overall knife, I'm going to give this one a tie, and I really am torn, but I think the spider hole does definitely weaken the overall structural integrity of this blade. If this was solid all the way through, you'd probably see this take the win, but I think this is a pretty solid piece of steel in itself, and I think if you just look at the steel, not the overall knife and the build of the pivot and everything else, I think this is just as sturdy of a blade. So, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong on this one. Comment below if you think I'm incorrectly scoring this, but I want to give that one a tie as well. And that's purely for the fact that I think if you did the strength test on these, you'd find that that hole is going to be the breaking point just as often as this is going to break in the middle. So that'd be interesting to try out. I'm not at the point with this channel yet where I'm going to be breaking $150 to $200 knives, trying that out, but I hope I get there someday. How about ease of maintenance in the field? The main difference would likely be in the locking system, which is going to be the difference of the Omega springs versus that giant coil spring. So if you're going to ask me which one is going to have the best, I guess the easiest field maintenance, neither of these are going to be great to take apart, but it's going to be very hard for something to happen to that ball bearing lock and that coil spring. If you were to get a stick jam just the right way, you could hypothetically break one of those Omega springs without taking the knife apart. And if that happens, you're going to have a hell of a time getting this thing put back together and cleaned and all that stuff properly. So I'm going to give the edge in this one to the Manix 2. You're probably not going to have to do anything to either of them, but I think it's much more likely that the 940-2 has an issue than the Manix 2. Both of which are going to suck to have to deal with in the field if you have to take them apart. I've seen videos on both. Those type of compression-based bearing or axle systems, they just definitely, they're all spring-loaded, and when you take the scales off, basically everything goes flying. Not going to go out of my way to take either of those apart in the field if I can help it. So handle properties, the handle materials are both G10, textured very differently. So this is a very smooth, fine textured G10. This is a little bit more coarse. I've got to give the edge to the Manix 2 on this one. The contouring and the overall work put into the scales of the 940-2 it's probably better than the Manix 2, but it's not as grippy, doesn't feel as sturdy in the hand, and they don't feel as sturdy themselves because they certainly don't look it. The Manix 2, those G10 slabs are pretty hefty, and they're a lot grippier. The way that they're cut out, I mean, we'll get more into the ergonomics in a minute here, but that's a good sturdy feeling handle scale, and I'm going to give the edge in the handle material. While it's the same material, it's just better quality, thicker, more durable. Give the point to the Manix 2. And in ergos, while we're right there, let's not spend too much time talking about that, because if you've ever handled the Manix 2, I'd love to hear you say that it's not extremely comfortable in the hand. Maybe we have a difference of opinion on that one, but it is just about as comfortable and ergonomic of a knife as a person could possibly make. Comfort, hotspot potential. I have not used the 940-2 for any long-term hard use, but it's smaller in the hand, and I have to adjust a little bit to make it fit right if I'm really going to bear down on it. Whereas the Manix 2, all I got to do is make a fist around it, and I'm good to go. I've used this thing plenty, and for some longer tasks, I've never had a hotspot with this knife. I'm going to give the edge in this category again to Manix 2. And the overall handle design. This is one where I wish I could give a point to both of them, or that I could even give them a tie, because I really think they've done a phenomenal job. Warren Osborne and the Benchmade crew putting this handle together created something that fits very well in even a large hand for a very, very small knife that's only about 2.5 ounces. So I think the handle execution on this knife deserves like some serious awards and all that. It's just incredible. If it wasn't being compared to the Manix 2, it probably would beat most other knives just because of how awesome they've executed that. But you can't beat this. It's the Manix 2. It is one of the most highly reputable folding knives on the market. There's a lot of folks who've handled both this and the PM2, which will tell you that the Paramilitary 2 is great, but the Manix 2 kind of, I don't want to say ruins the Paramilitary 2 for you, but it certainly lowers it on the podium at least a couple of stages. So the Manix 2, to me, as far as overall handle design, I don't know that I've held a knife that feels better in the hand yet. So Manix 2 gets that point as well. And we're starting to see a little bit of a decent spread here. Let's see if things even out in the next few categories. So sheath or locking system. In this case, we're talking about the locking system and the pocket clip and the detent of the knife. So not sheath, not so much retention, more the lock, pocket clip, and the detent. So materials, as far as the locking mechanism goes, you've got a bar here in the axis lock, and you can see the axis moving about here as I manipulate the axis lock. That slides in behind the tang and locks it into place. And these two little springs here called omega springs, which are kind of hard to see. Don't know if the lighting or anything is going to help. And maybe you can see there's these two little lines running along the left side of that. They're very, very fragile, very tiny, just a low gauge wire, essentially. I don't know how much I trust those in the field long term. I'm still waiting to see something bad happen. There are a few stories, but really people say they hold up quite well. But omega springs are more likely to fail than this coil spring, because if you look in here, you've got, well, what is a ball bearing, which you can't really see the ball bearing very well, but maybe the micro stream will help us out here again. You have the tang of the blade, which moves around inside of there. And once you get to the point where this little groove shows up, there's a ball bearing that is going to pop into place. And this coil spring in behind here is shoving that ball bearing in and holding it into place, which is under those plastic caps. Now, those plastic caps, while plastic, are incredibly durable, and they feel just as sturdy as anything else on the knife. That being said, if something was to break, I feel like it would have to be these, which is still unlikely, and you can get Flytanium replacements for all this and a Flytanium cage instead of the plastic ball bearing cage, but I don't know if I'm ever going to do that myself, because I feel very, very confident in this knife as is. Because I've thought about this a lot, and these are two knives that I considered purchasing as replacements for my Cold Steel Recon 1, and really one of the biggest deciding factors for me was the omega springs versus the ball bearing lock. I've got to say, there's no question in my mind, the better construction and the more reliable construction is in the Manix 2's ball bearing lock. For ease of use, I've used these a lot. I've fidgeted with them both, and they're both quite well, they're about as broken in as they're going to get, we'll say that. I've got to give the edge to the Axis lock. Sorry, not the Manix 2. The Axis lock is one of the most easy to manipulate locking systems on the planet. Just took my pen out there. And the Super Freak, very similar. It's a much larger knife, much heftier knife. I was almost expecting the Axis lock to be a little less fidgety and maneuverable, but it's very, very smooth, and it's a very, very good system. As far as the hard use capabilities, I'm not sure about that. But for the ease of use, the Manix 2 is great, but it does get a little bit clogged up, and when it does, I wouldn't say it clogged up. It's not as smooth or as fidgety once this thing gets a little bit gritty and grimy, and the ball bearing lock definitely needs a little bit more thumb strength in order to pull it back. And when you're breaking this thing in, I mean, I had some pretty good sores on my thumbs just from trying to peel that lock back. I got to give the edge of ease of use to the axis lock 940-2. So security and retention. This is one that I actually have a pretty good reason to score it the way that I'm going to score it, because the Manix 2 is incredibly solid. The detent is great. You really don't have, I've never at least had any issue with this knife partially opening and becoming a safety hazard for me in my pocket or otherwise. Maybe if you loosen up the pivot, it would be more of an issue, but I think this is pretty solid and safe so long as it's closed. Now the 940-2, I could tighten this pivot up a little bit, but it's very, very worn in the way it is right now, and I don't feel like I really need to. The only downside is if I did tighten this up more, it would be a little bit less fidgety, be a little harder to deploy, but it would be a little safer, because if you look here and you hear that, it's not the safest knife in the world in the pocket, and the detent could be better. And I tossed this to a coworker once to show him, and it kind of partially opened up a little bit. Not much, but I think it pricked his thumb a little bit, enough to make him jump a bit. And it was probably not the safest thing to do, that you shouldn't throw your pocket knives. As soon as I did it, I realized I shouldn't throw my pocket knives. It's not the first time anyone's ever said that. However, wow, that was quite the explosive launch. However, I did throw this, and in doing that, I have confirm the fact that this does not stay closed all the way all the time. I actually also sliced my finger open on it once, carrying this in my offhand pocket, so it's got my left hand clip on it now for my typical carry, and I carried it in my right pocket, which when you carry it the wrong way, you're going to have your blade facing forward instead of back against the back of your pocket. So in this way, if you go reach in your pocket and you hit that thumb stud, or something happens that it just happens to open up partially, you go to reach in your pocket like I did, and I might still have a scar here. Yes, I do, right there. This was actually from the Rat 2, but similar thing to where I reached in and it's kind of skewered my hand a little bit. Now, both of these, the pocket clips are great, and I have no issue with either of them. Really, I guess I'd be more likely to lose the Manix 2 because the way the spoon clip kind of scoops out, you can clip it on some things, and I have got this caught on, say, like a seatbelt or paracord before and have it sort of fall out of my pocket. I've had that happen with other knives as well, but maybe more likely with the spoon clip on the Spydercos. Detent, the security and retention, we're going to give that one to the Manix 2 100%. So if you're unfamiliar with a forestry dot tally, which I'd imagine most everybody is on this channel, we're at 8, 9, and one more point makes the X for 10. So you've got 9, 2, and 2 right now as far as our score goes. As far as safety of the user while using the knife, the 940-2 is great. It doesn't have the same finger protection as the Manix 2 does. And I don't know if there's ever going to be an issue of me sliding my hand up over the blade when in the normal position. The front finger choil position, it can happen, but still fairly secure and just as secure as most other knives. You can't put your, well, you can, I wouldn't recommend it, going into the front finger choil position on the 940-2. But when you have this thing gripped in your hand, it's pretty solid, but there's definitely an ability for your hand to slide up over that if the pressure was adequate or if you were at the right angle. So safety of the user, gonna give that one as well to the Manix 2. Oh no, I really thought this one would be more even than this. Maybe it's gonna balance out as we get further down here. Okay, how about ambidexterity, which these are two knives that were high on my list because they're both very ambidextrous. The ball bearing lock, extremely ambidextrous. The pocket clips are the only thing you got to switch around on either of these knives. The axis lock and the ball bearing lock, both 100% ambidextrous. In fact, the only things that aren't ambidextrous on these knives are the pocket clips, which you have to switch around, which basically make the knife usable to either hand. So the studs are not even interchangeable. They are ambidextrous and symmetrical, and the spider hole, of course, is the same no matter which side you use it on. So ambidextrous features, going to be a tie on that one. I don't really find one is easier or harder to use with my left or right hand. Like I mentioned, a couple of these smaller categories, I've given a couple extra points just to kind of balance things out and give them a little more weight. So also interchangeable use in either hand, I would say, yeah, that does fall in the same category. These are slightly different, but mostly the same, but we're going to give them both a tie. And adaptability for lefties. So let's say they are a right-handed design, and this might be a little more specific for something that's not as ambidextrous, but say has a good design that's able to be used by left-handed people. A bad example of that would be something like the Kershaw Blur, which essentially, if you're not right-handed, you're not going to be able to carry this and use it like a normal knife because it only has the one pocket clip. Whereas the Topps Mill Spy Elite, the top sheaths carry for right-handed people, and they're not ambidextrous, so you'd have to order something specifically for a left-handed person. But you can move these around in such a way that you've got so many different options to carry. For example, if I'm carrying this on my right side, if I want to carry it handle down, it's got to be carried, you know, forward draw. If I wanted to carry it reverse draw handle down, I'd have to carry it on my left side. So I guess the thing is, this is more adaptable than some other knives, but in the case of the Manix 2 and the 940-2, there really is nothing to adapt because these things are already so ambidextrous. We're just going to continue that along with the tie. So no advantage gains in the ambidexterity department, and let's look at function. Oh, and you know what? I have overall ambidexterity here as a scoreable mark as well. Anything I have marked as red. As far as the overall ambidexterity, again, I don't think I can give the edge to one or the other in this case. So essentially, this whole section for these knives is a dud. Okay, now we're looking at the different functions and the purposes as to why you might purchase or use these knives. As far as a main EDC knife, for cutting paper, cardboard, letters, all that kind of stuff, you got to slice a little bit of rope or take a thread off of a shirt. Well, main EDC use. Main EDC use. If you're talking about something you're going to be carrying in a pocket, slicing and dicing, I gotta give the edge to the 940-2 only for the pound for pound capability ratio, I suppose. This is almost twice as heavy. It takes up easily twice as much pocket room, and you feel this in your pocket. The 940-2 disappears completely. It's got more usable cutting edge, rather. So you're going to be able to get just as much slicing and EDC capability out of this knife for a much smaller package. And when it comes to EDC, for most people, not even so much myself, but for most people, size does matter. This really is just a lot better EDC carry for most people compared to a lot of these mid to large size Spyderco knives. So the main EDC, I'll give that one to the 940-2, I think, without any doubt. Even though this is a more preferable EDC to me, thinking as a whole, the better EDC slicer for small, non-hard use tasks, definitely the 940-2. So supplementary EDC. So as a backup knife or just in an extra slot, a lot of us carry more than one knives on us when we're out and about. Actually, it surprised me. I think it was hog poll number 3 on the Tuesday hog polls on the community tab on the hog page. There's a lot of folks, if not the vast majority, who carry at least 2 or 3 knives on them, at least as far as the hog channel viewers go. So yeah, kind of surprising, but yeah, also not disappointing because it's good to have more than one knife on you in case you need it. And for me, I've been carrying the 940-2 as my steak knife for the last 8-9 months since I purchased it. It's almost always on my person because it slips away in an extra pocket very, very, very well. Very thin, very low profile, very light. Works very, very well as a supplementary EDC for whatever purpose you might want it to serve. Oh, I just accidentally marked a tie there. I'll just note that one for later and not mark my next tie. So hard use EDC. No question, Manix 2. Challenge me on that, will you? I dare you. The Manix 2 is the more hard use knife out of the two of them. I'm sure the 940-2 would also cut some plastic and metal strapping if it had to. They're using the same steel. But as far as like prying and twisting and beating a knife off of stuff in the way that you typically shouldn't, the 940-2 is not going to hold up to the same amount of use and abuse. How about defensive or combative use? If you are military, law enforcement, some kind of a fancy ninja martial artists who live in a foreign land where you're getting attacked on the street with swords and knives, if that's you, or like me, for example, where you're carrying a knife more for EDC use, and if you're in the woods, maybe a little wildlife self-defense, if it ever came to that, is this a good defensive or tactical knife in those situations? I think the 940-2 probably isn't going to do quite as good as the Manix 2 when it comes to any sort of thrusting or stabbing, only because the hand protection. I'm big on finger protection and a nice finger choil because slicing is good, but if you're ever really in a life or death situation with whatever, you're going to need penetration, or you're going to want penetration in order to end that threat. And stabbing and thrusting is not going to be as good if you lose your knife the first time you stab and you also lose a finger or two with it. As someone who thinks about this stuff quite a bit, and not the most experienced person with any of this, but someone who really tries to come at this from a functional and logical point of view, and I really try and listen to folks who have more experience with this stuff talk about it, I don't think any of them would ever want to have the 940-2 as their main defensive blade. Maybe they wouldn't want the Manix 2, but I'm sure out of the two of these, this is probably what they're going to go with. And at least for this versus video, that's what I'm going to go with, the Manix 2. And another dot for you. Bushcraft, batoning, whittling, carving, feather sticking, chopping, notching, all that stuff. Not either of these are going to be a good bush knife. You do not want to baton with a folding knife. Maybe if it's a cold steel triad lock, you can get away with it. Yes, you can, actually. Yes, you can. But these are not bush knives. However, I have carried these in the bush, both of these, for a decent amount of time. And if I had to do any whittling or carving, I'd rather use the Manix 2 than the 940-2. I do find that this blade works very well for that kind of stuff. The spear point blade allows for very precision work. If you're doing any carving or scraping or using the tip for anything, the 940-2 works just fine. It's just not quite as good for biting into wood and stuff. I just don't find the edge is nearly as slicey or capable when it comes to whittling or doing any kind of woodwork. Bushcraft department, we're giving it to the Manix 2, although not by a ton, because neither of these are great for bushcraft work. How about for emergency, SAR work, EMT, structure fire? So a little more hard use. Let's say maybe you have to pry open a car door would be the most extreme example, but even just like cutting seat belts, dealing with clothing and that sort of thing. You know, the 940-2 for carrying is going to be a lot easier. You're going to be able to put it on your kit anywheres and not really feel it. Weight does matter in some of those environments. I would imagine especially things like high angle rescue or search and rescue if you're doing a lot of long hiking, rucking, anything like that, canoeing. I think it's going to be a matter of preference, you know, between these two. I don't know if one has the edge over the other as far as like cutting seat belts and stuff like that. Both of these aren't exactly ideal to avoid stabbing a patient. I'm going to give it a tie. There's pros and cons to either. This is more sturdy and hard use. This is lighter and easier to store on your person while giving you just as much capability, maybe a little bit not as much hard use capability, but I don't know. I don't think there's really one that shines over the other. Going to give that a tie. And I already marked that one previously, so I'll leave that. Okay, so the last function is, what if this was my only knife? If this was an apocalypse knife? If I had to rely on this thing for a long period of time, knowing that if it broke on me, I would be screwed. Manix 2, no discussion needing to be had there based on pretty much everything I talked about around the Omega springs and the overall hard use capabilities of this knife. Now on to page 2. So let's see how we're looking. How about cleaning? So the maintenance and cleaning of this knife or these knives, both of which fairly easy. However, the Manix 2 has got a little more closed-in locking system, I guess, than the 940-2, and the grit and pocket lint does get jammed in there quite easily. Otherwise, they're both pretty similar. I will say the pivot has been easier to clean out of the 940-2. It's harder to get all of the grime from the Manix 2, and this does get pretty gritty. It doesn't really affect the function too much, but if you're looking for fancy drop cutting action, you're not going to get it out of my Manix 2 in particular. I'll say the cleaning is definitely easier on the 940-2. I noticed I screwed my scoring system up there too. I put a line there. Should have been a fourth dot first. So there's a total of 4, and I'm 1-0ing for that one. For the ongoing maintenance, I will give it again to the 940 because I have to every now and then clean the pivot out of this to get it running really smooth. It's not affecting the overall function of the knife, but I do think this tends to get a little bit grittier, whereas this one over time, it can get gritty, but I find that the pivot system's loose enough or there's enough room for dirt and debris to fly out of it. It seems to be only getting better with time, and I don't know that I've lubed this thing up in quite a while. So this one, the more I use it, seems to be working smoother and smoother, whereas this one almost seems like it would require a little bit of TLC from time to time while not affecting the overall durability or toughness of the knife. But ongoing maintenance, I've had to do less to the 940-2. Disassembly and reassembly, I've watched videos on both. They both really suck. I don't know if one's better or worse than the other, except the 940-2's got those little tiny Omega springs. Versus the one big coil of the ball bearing lock. I am going to give this a tie, and I'm going to let you people in the comments decide. If you've taken one or both of these apart, tell me which one's worse, and in your opinion, which one should get the point. And if I have to look, I don't think it's going to be this close of a match anyways, that's going to be the deciding factor. But let me know what you're thinking, and I'll adjust accordingly if need be. Okay, we're getting closer. So the aesthetics, and I guess my own personal opinion of the looks. As far as the blade goes, I think I've mentioned this already. The looks of the blade, aesthetically, going to the 940-2. When I first seen the way that was ground, I was just blown away by how unique and cool that is. It almost looks like a I don't know, like a weird rhino horn or something. But yeah, the looks-wise blade score is going to the 940-2. For the handle, looks-wise, the 940-2 is just a sexy friggin' knife. Okay, and overall looks, same thing, which makes sense. If the blade's more attractive and the handle's more attractive, I probably like the overall knife better, but you never know. I gave myself some options here in case that wasn't the case. This is actually catching the 940-2 up quite a bit over in this section. And so how about the subjective public perception? If I were to haul either of these knives out, which is more appealing to the public, which is going to be less likely to scare them? That's a hard one. They're both black, they're both satin finish. One's quite a bit larger. I would argue that the 940-2 looks a little more devious. But this was also created by a freaking rancher to be like a gentleman's carry. So the Manix 2 is kind of ugly. It's more of an eye catcher. And if you're not a knife person, you're going to look at this thing weird, whether you think it's violent or tactical or not. The 940-2 might get away as a little bit more of a typical pocket knife. So in that category, and because of the fact that the 940-2 is partially designed to be a bit of a classier knife that you can also work with, I'll give the public perception to the 940-2 on that one. Holy catch up. Okay, coming from behind. Customization options. So that one's going to have to go to the Manix 2 because the 940-2, I think, is one of the knives in Benchmade's lineup that does not have any options in the Benchmade customization shop or the custom build shop or whatever they call it. You can go on the website for like the bug out and a lot of their popular knives and pick the blade type, pick the handle scales, pick the steel finish and steel type and all that stuff. But the 940-2 does not have any of those options. You've got the 940 original with the aluminum scales, this one with the G10, you've got the carbon fiber version, the full auto version, the 945 smaller version. So there is some options, but the Manix 2 has got, geez, the lightweight version and a couple different steels. This main version comes in, oh goodness, 3 or 4 or 5, at least 2 or 3 steels on the regular runs, and then there's all kinds of sprint runs, and there's different blade finishes. There's the Manix XL as well. I'd say as far as the different options, the Manix 2 is going to win that one. But both have tons of different varieties or flavors, as the knife world likes to call it, and you can pick your poison. Now for the overall fit and finish. When I got these two out of the box, they were both impressive, but both required a lot of time and deployments in order to wear down the locking systems and the pivots. The 940-2 had a little bit of finish issue, and the lock needed to be broken in. There was a bit of axis lock stick. You can check out my first couple videos about the 940-2 where I discuss all of that. This thing's breaking in well over time, and it's only getting better, but the Manix 2 was just put together better, and the chances of me ever having to disassemble or do anything to this knife, I feel, are very, very slim. Fit and finish to the Manix 2. Sorry, Benchmade. So last thing is the value. So does this thing fill a void in the market? So if there is a specific niche that has been filled by one of these knives, it's going to get an extra bonus point kind of just for that. Is there a void filled? You know, in the case of the 940-2, I can say that this was a knife designed to be a work knife you could also carry to church kind of thing by Warren Osborne, and that's pretty purpose driven, and there's a few knives you can get away with doing both, but this was very specifically designed for that purpose. The Manix 2, it was purpose built, and it was designed to fill Spyderco's void in their lineup, which was they needed something a little more hard use than the Manix 2 or the military or some of the other right-hand Spider flicks. You'd be the death of me. It is a kind of an answer for Spyderco's issue, but it doesn't fill a void in the knife market the same way that I feel the 940-2 did. You could use some other fancy knives as work knives, but they're not going to look as good in a shirt pocket, and they're not going to be able to perform as well while also being presentable in a say a church environment. Perhaps the best way to illustrate it is by saying that you've got knives like the Recon 1, which are great work knives, but if you haul that out in a bank, you're going to be in trouble. Or you've got something like the CEO from CRKT, which I wouldn't work with too hard. But it looks great, and it's great if you wanted to throw that in a suit pocket, but this is kind of the best of both worlds where you've got fancy dress-up knife, which can still do some work. This category isn't one that's always going to get checked for one knife or the other, but we are, in this case, going to give the 940-2 an edge on filling a void in the market. At least in my opinion, which, as always, you can argue with down below in the comments. Speaking of down below, have you hit that like button yet? Price range. So the price of these two, Overall, which one is going to be more affordable, I guess, is sort of the way I should have worded this. So price range / affordability. How about that? Affordability, spelled right, I think. Going to give that to the Manix 2. You pay for the so-called butterfly tax, as they say, which you're getting maybe a little bit better quality finish and maybe a little more time spent on certain aspects of the knife, but you're going to pay a little more for a Benchmade most of the time. The Manix 2, you get more knife, a beefier knife, a more capable knife for less money. So in that case, we're giving it to the Manix 2. Worth the money asked. Which of these two do you feel like you've paid the appropriate amount of money for? 940-2, you're a little bit too expensive. Same exact thing. And like I've mentioned at the beginning, these categories are somewhat similar, but I've given a little bit of wiggle room for some nuance in case there were some differences. Otherwise, if a knife was overall better value than the other, I allowed this to give a few extra points. So it wasn't just if a knife was incredible value but didn't have as good as specs. I didn't want the specs to overwhelm the score system so much that a good value knife didn't have a chance at winning. So if you're wondering why some of these are going to be scored similarly, it's because there's a little bit of room for balancing the score system there. At least that's my hope. So worth the money asked. The Manix 2 I found for the $160-$70 I paid for it was definitely worth it. Maybe closer to 200 actually, now that I think about it, taxes in. And those are in Canadian dollars, by the way. You're going to pay about maybe 180 max, I think, in American dollars for the 940-2, closer to 220, 230 in Canadian dollars. We're looking at around 150 or 40 for American and about 170, 80, 90 in Canadian dollars. So comparative bang for your buck value, I'm going to do the same for the Manix 2 again. So there's the 1 and 2. So Manix 2 for comparative bang for your buck rather. The warranty. They're both somewhat similar from what I can tell. American made, American manufactured knives. If you have an issue with either of these knives, you send them back to the company. They'll deal with it. So long as it wasn't totally your fault, they will fix it up for you. If you want your blade sharpened, send it back to either of the brands and they'll sharpen their own knives for you and send them back as long as you pay the shipping. If you disassemble either of these knives, the warranty is void. So that's a big issue if you want to do some customization and all that. So because of the fact that they're very similar in their warranty and their customer service, and I've heard, not horror stories, but I've heard good and bad with both, I am going to give a tie to the warranty and customer service because I personally have not had or heard enough stories to lean me one way or the other. But again, if you have your experiences that have had you leaning one way or the other in the past, let me know what you're thinking about the warranty customer service of Benchmade or Spyderco. So I'm going to double check my dot tallies and make sure I have everything right here, but I think we know what the outcome's going to be. So just stand by one. Okay, the scores have been tallied and double checked, and we have the final score. Out of a total possible 40 points, the Manix 2 has taken 19, the 940-2 has taken 11, and 10 categories were actually tied, which is a lot higher than the first versus video I had done with the Guardian 3 and the Azula 2. So the winner by a landslide, and probably to nobody's surprise if you ever watched any of my videos discussing either of these two knives, the winner is the Manix 2 from Spyderco. So 940-2, great knife, one that's seen as much or more pocket time as any other knife in the last year that I own. However, it's only ever there as a backup. It's a great steak knife, cooking knife, anything like that you want to use for food prep, or anything where you don't want to be dulling up your slicier, razor sharp EDC knives. That's really the main purpose that the 940-2 is served for me. It's a great knife, but overall, for what I'm looking for as far as like hard-on gear approved knives and gear, the 940-2 is just an inferior piece of equipment to the Manix 2. I'll put the amzn.to links at the top of the video for these guys if you want to click through and help support the channel by doing some Amazon shopping through there. Feel free to check out those affiliate links or help the channel out through Patreon or anything like that. Or more appreciated would be just liking the video, subscribing, turning the notification bell on, and checking out some of the other content I've got over on the right-hand side of the screen. I'll pop up the other versus video of the Azula 2 and Guardian 3, as well as some other content that you'll see over on the right. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. This is the Hard On Gear channel signing off.